Anin, Niji, Patty Loew, Indigenous, Mashkazibi, and Dojiba, Mangdodem. I have just introduced myself as Patty Loew. I'm a member of the Bad River Band of Lake Superior, Ojibwe, although we call it Medicine River, not Bad River. It's not bad at all. And I'm a member of the Loon Clan. I'd like to acknowledge and thank the members of the Minnewankaton Sioux Dakota people who are here and acknowledge that we're meeting on their ancestral lands. So, Che Miigwech. And how long? I'm a television reporter, so I have to know how long I'm supposed to go, and I'll get you there like within 5 seconds. So, is it 20 minutes or 30 minutes? 20, 25, okay. The title, Moving Forward But Not Beyond, is intentional because we have a lot of work to do at Northwestern. But the first step is acknowledgement. And I loved the comment this morning, knowledge is responsibility, and I'm going to remember that. In 2014, there was a lot of finger pointing and interest in looking back at this man, John Evans, for whom the city of Evanston is named and who founded Northwestern University and the University of Denver. He was territorial governor in the mid-19th century. A physician, he established some seminaries, he is a railroad tycoon, and he was complicit in the Sand Creek Massacre. Little background, how many of you know about the Sand Creek Massacre? So maybe half the audience, okay. So in the summer of 1864, and remember, the United States was preoccupied with the Civil War, so not a lot of eyes were on what was happening in the West, but there were a lot of reputations being made in the West by soldiers who wanted to get back to the East, and Indian wars were a way to build that reputation. So in the summer of 1864, John Evans, as territorial governor, ordered peaceful Indians to Sand Creek. He then raised and equipped a militia, and he put his friend John Shivington in charge. Shivington was an ordained minister, interestingly enough. Evans instructed the militia that he raised and armed to kill hostile Indians, and Shivington attacked Sand Creek, even though that village was flying the United States flag as well as a white flag of peace. The soldiers massacred 200 Cheyenne and Arapaho, mostly women and children, and then what followed was truly horrific. Rape, mutilation, murder, body parts paraded and displayed in the city of Denver, hung in the Denver theater. I want to play an excerpt from a PBS documentary that was done by Colorado Public Television.
Others would say I drew the line at killing women and children, or I drew the line at mutilating. We don't know how many of the troops, but there were a fair number that did engage in dismembering the dead and, again, taking human body parts and other belongings.
The soldiers went through that camp. They took what they wanted, pillaged all the chiefs and all of the medicine men, all their medicine pipes, articles were taken, piled up on heaps of leftover buffalo robes, teepees, belongings, piled up in those piles and set afire. They were burned.
About 200 were killed at Sand Creek. Another 200 were wounded. and it's hard to tell how many of those died. And so they returned to Denver as heroes, and their parade through Denver was about 2 miles long.
They had a big parade here in front of the state capitol, marching body parts, picture parade they call it, marching body parts of tribal people, shining apples.
How do you atone for something like that? And this is very much in the memory of descendants of Sand Creek. There are people today who remember the stories that their grandparents and great-grandparents told of surviving this horrific event. In the aftermath of Sand Creek, John Evans lied about the intent and attempted to cover it up. He and Shivington were called before Congress. Evans was stripped of his governorship. John Shivington was court-martialed. And then life went on. Evans made quite a fortune from his activities in the West. And Northwestern University is the beneficiary of his original endowment. The phrase that came out during the investigation that Northwestern conducted was collective amnesia. So there was about 150 years of collective amnesia until 2014. At that time, the University of Denver and Northwestern University both conducted investigations into what John Evans' level of culpability was. And interestingly enough, the universities came up with completely different conclusions, although the recommendations were very similar. So from the Denver report, Evans' actions and influence, this is a quote from the summary, Evans' actions and influence, more than those of any other political official in Colorado Territory, created the conditions in which the massacre was highly likely. Evans abrogated his duties as superintendent. He was also superintendent of Indian Affairs at the time. Fanned the flames of war when he could have dampened them. Cultivated an unusually interdependent relationship with the military, and rejected clear opportunities to engage in peaceful negotiations with the Native peoples under his jurisdiction. Furthermore, he successfully lobbied the War Department for the deployment of a federalized regiment, consisting largely of undertrained, undisciplined, volunteer soldiers who executed the worst of the atrocities during the massacre. So the Denver report concludes that John Evans was culpable for the Sand Creek massacre. The Northwestern report acknowledges Evans' quote-unquote moral failures, but concludes that, quote, no known evidence indicates that John Evans helped plan the Sand Creek massacre or had any knowledge of it in advance. There's a surprising number of passive sentences in the report. But the recommendations that came out of that steering committee in that investigative report are pretty direct and pretty explicit. And in getting to those recommendations, the Evans Study Committee report concluded that for a long stretch, the university participated in and perpetuated a collective amnesia that not just disconnected John Evans from the massacre, but erased it entirely. No one at Northwestern seemed to notice or record Evans' refusal to condemn the massacre, and the shameful way he minimized and justified it. Never apologized. Just as the university has gained from his actions and his gifts, it has also benefited from his good reputation. In fact, Northwestern has burnished that reputation and used it to grace professorships, buildings, and organizations. In doing so, the university has ignored a deplorable aspect of Evans' career that exposed a deep flaw in his moral character At the same time, Northwestern has neglected its and every other university's fundamental commitment to discovering and discussing the truth, including about itself. The most significant way in which the university can move to correct this is by taking steps that are in keeping with its leadership role in society as an institution of higher learning. These include increasing the access of Native Americans to a Northwestern education and of all Northwestern students to the study of Native American history and cultures. So how do you indigenize a campus? And I'm going to pause here because you can see I've added birch bark to the, I've taken the plain end, the plain white end, and added some birch bark to it. Well, that's kind of where my colleagues and I come in. Although there was work that was done before I arrived. I've been at Northwestern for a year. I taught at the University of Wisconsin-Madison for about 20 years and was involved in some Native American initiatives there, and this was an opportunity for me to help Northwestern get this center off the ground. So before I arrived, people were already trying to indigenize the way they related to Native people. And you'll see relationships, visibility, knowledge, and people. I'm going to talk mostly about relationships, but there was this understanding that Northwestern needed to atone directly to the Cheyenne and Arapaho nations, that it needed to develop relationships with local tribal communities in the Great Lakes region and participate, and in fact it is participating in Sand Creek Massacre commemorations and even hosting some in Chicago. Visibility, I'm not going to talk much about that. Knowledge, one of the things that the center is doing is promoting research, and we have just delivered the penultimate draft of the minor that we hope will begin in 2019. I'll talk more about that. And then people, the faculty and staff that the university has hired to help with this initiative. This is the timeline. This happened before I arrived. After this report came out, the university chose a one-book read and chose The Inconvenient Indian. So everybody in the university read this book. The university then assembled a Native Leadership Council. These are some of the great minds in Indian studies, the Brian Brayboys and Elizabeth Hoovers and Dr. Loew. So getting prominent Native scholars to advise the university on some of these initiatives. Then there were hires at the Block Museum. There were art exhibitions. The Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences wrote a large, successful grant with the Mellon Foundation to provide seed money for these initiatives. There was a student affairs expert, a student affairs focused admissions person hired. It continued the next year. There was I can't tell you what Creating Nations Symposium was about because I wasn't on campus at that time. There was a steering committee that was formed to implement some of the recommendations that came out of the Evans study panel. And then in May 2016, things started to heat up. I spent a quarter there as a visiting professor. The university hired Doug Keel as an assistant professor. Doug is Oneida and teaches history. He's and Beth Redbird, who's Oglala Lakota and Oklahoma Choctaw, in sociology. Created the steering committee. And then in December of 2016, they announced that they had received the successful Mellon grant to establish the Center for Native American and Indigenous Research. And then a senior program coordinator was hired, who's Menominee Oneida. And then they offered a position for me, and my retirement from UW-Madison was short-lived. And next thing I know, I'm living in Chicago. So when I was, my first conversation with some of the deans who hired me one of the first questions they asked was, what are your goals? And my answer was, I have no idea. And they were kind of taken aback, and I said, because that's basically been what's wrong with academia. We think we know what's right for people, and nobody listens. So until I listen to the urban Indian population, until I listen to the nearby tribes like Pokagon, Potawatomi, I can't tell you what our goals will be, because the kind of research that I want to do is collaborative and cooperative and framed by the communities that we're partnering with. So I said, the first year, we need to just focus on relationships and try to figure out what we need to do, work on ourselves to get ready for this new initiative that we want. We say we want Native students. We're not ready for Native students because we don't have the environment to nurture them. We don't know what they need. We don't know how to retain them. And the last thing that we want to do is accept somebody into a program, and they're probably one of the smartest people in their communities. And if they fail and they go back to their communities, it has such a chilling effect on everybody else. Well, she's the smartest person I know, and if she can't make it at Northwestern, then I certainly can't. And so, these were really things we wanted to be really intentional. One of the first things we decided to do was to focus on ways that we could atone directly to the Cheyenne, Arapaho communities and figure out what they thought we needed to do in order to be the kinds of partners that they could trust and wanted to collaborate with and research and outreach, and the kind of university that maybe someday they might think about sending their students to. So we've been participating in events. We have a relationship with people from Chief Del Knife College. They've been coming and advising us, and that's ongoing. We've reached out to the urban Indian community. We're collaborating with them, and a lot of it is just meeting people and listening, showing up at powwows, helping out. We actually hosted, AIC had, the American Indian Center was sort of between centers, and we hosted their 2017 powwow. We've gotten involved with an archiving project with them. We're doing collaborative grants, and we're co-sponsoring programs. Most recently, an Indigenous Peoples Day event where we partnered with 20 other locations around the country and 6 video streaming sites through Google Hangouts, Facebook Live, and Free Speech TV, which cut between each of the locations. We provided the red line drum that started everything off, and then we all watched a film together and responded to it in real time and used that film as a springboard to talk about environmental threats in our own communities. We've been creating relationships with Great Lakes nations, and I've been working in Wisconsin for my entire life, and that was the one strength I brought to Northwestern, was existing relationships with Great Lakes tribes. And so we've been trying to strengthen those and working on projects. We have a Mukutu project with 3 Ojibwe tribes and the National Park Service in about the gathering traditional ecological knowledge about the Great Lakes, the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore. My colleague Kelly Weiskopf is doing an Indigenous arts and activism and changing climates surrounding the Mississippi River Valley and working with the Indigenous communities in that region. This is a little bit more about my TEK project. Karen mentioned in my introduction that I work with tribal teens and teach them digital storytelling, and we pivoted our project to this national park project, gathering TEK and videotaped interviews, and then using this Indigenous archiving system called Mukutu, which is developed in Australia, I believe, which allows you to allows the Indigenous community and specifically the tribal historic preservation officers to determine what information can be shared with the public and which needs to be firewalled and protected as protected cultural knowledge. Our new old colleague Megan Bang, who some of you probably know, she's a superstar in education. She and Doug Medine are continuing some collaborative research with the Menominee Nation and with the urban Indian population. And then one of the things that, because I'm all about new media and digital humanities and video, we are creating an Indigenous tour of Northwestern, actually 2 of them. A virtual tour that you can access on a mobile app, and a walking tour that will use augmented reality. So when a visitor to Northwestern arrives, he or she, if they want to do the walking tour, will start on the Lake Michigan shoreline, and they'll hear, we're collaborating with the Pequegan, Potawatomi, and some Ojibwe communities to create a soundscape of Indigenous, you're going to hear Indigenous language and get descriptions of lifeways pre-encounter, and then multimedia that will explain how the treaties happened and how the land moved from Three Fires Indigenous land to the federal government, to the state of Illinois, to Chicago and Evanston. One of the other things that we've been doing is thinking about ways that we can get our students some experiential learning. So for the last 3 times I've taught this class at Northwestern, including this fall, I take my students to the Oneida Reservation in Wisconsin during the White Corn Festival. So my students are, they have a lot of corn that they have to process. So they're always happy to see us and they feed us well, but you know, we sit around this barn with this enormous pile of white corn, and my students are first picking and then shucking and braiding corn, and it's a monotonous kind of activity. But this is where storytelling takes place, and the elders tell them stories, and it's absolutely wonderful. It culminates in a talking circle, and half my students were in tears. They were overwhelmed with how wonderful the experience was. So this is something we want to do more of. And then finally, the people. Northwestern has a lot of resources. This is different than a public land-grant university. This is a private institution that has pretty deep pockets. And one of the things that they've done is invest. I really do believe that they're serious about atoning and trying to repair and acknowledge what their founder did, and that all of us that are connected to this university have benefited from this sordid past that our founder, created. And it has been investing quite a few resources, and just in the time that I've been there, all of these Native people have been hired, and I've only been there a year. So, Jasmine Gurno is our senior program coordinator for diversity. Doug Keel is in history. Beth Redbird is in sociology. Jennifer Michaels is the cerebral cortex of the center. Beatrice Reyes is in global, she's Dene, and she is in global health studies. Pam Silas is our associate director for engagement and outreach. Pam is Menominee and Oneida. Megan Bang is Ojibwe, Saginaw, Sault Ste. Marie. Erin Golding is Seneca. I'm Bad River. So the university really has put some money where its aspirations are. And then we just last week sent in our penultimate draft of a new minor to the College of Arts and Sciences in Weinberg. And we gave them the narrative and followed the directions on how you propose a minor, but we have a spatial drawing of what our minor is looking like with land and identity and a sense of the sacred in the middle. And we don't have academic disciplines. We've got, hubs, intellectual hubs of creative thought flowing from our four directions. And one of our last class that a student has to take will have a community connection. Our capstone class will be a way for students to use what they've learned and put into practical applied theory. So they're going to be working with a community and doing research that's meaningful and on the ground. Having said all this, we are not where we need to be yet. I mean, we have a lot of work to do. And some of our challenges, there are still too few Native American and Indigenous students. And we, again, have got some work to do before we're ready for more Native American students. Right now, we don't have a pathway plan to recruit Native and American and Indigenous students, but we're talking about pathway programs with particularly the Cheyenne and Arapaho, starting in middle school and building a cohort and providing really intense mentoring and preparation and visits to campus that get longer and longer, starting with sixth graders and maybe 1 week on campus, then at the end of seventh grade, 2 weeks, eighth grade, 3 weeks, et cetera, so that by the time they're seniors in high school, they would be ideally, this is my little vision, the university hasn't committed to this yet, but I think it's a good idea. By the time they're seniors in high school, they will have been prepared to succeed. They're admitted and they're provided 5 years of tuition-free support, and the other kinds of things that they need in order to succeed in our campus. We don't have a dedicated Native American recruiter or an admissions specialist. That's something we definitely need to have, because one of the things that I learned in listening sessions in Wisconsin among the Native communities there is, people would tell me, I'm not sure I want to send my daughter, all that way. She needs a grandma. Is there somebody there that can be a grandma? And so we're thinking about things like elders in residence and designated floors of dorms or a house where we can create a cohort and work on creating that sense of community that all of us know is so important. We also lack physical space. We exist and we're funding research, but we're in a 10 by 10 physical space. And this is, if we want to bring in artists in residence and elders in residence and visiting faculty, we need space. And we've become kind of a broken record on this. So we're not really ready yet for the students we say that we want. And I think it's really important. The emphasis has always been on, how can we prepare these students to be successful at our illustrious institutions? Well, we need to shift that thinking about what we can do for Native American and Indigenous students to make them fit and be successful, to what changes do we have to do as an institution in order to create a space that is nurturing to Native American students and a space that Native people trust. How can we become good partners? Because teaching is also learning, and we have a lot of learning to do. Che miigwech, appreciate it. Thank you.